Welcome to the Sales Leadership Awakening podcast. I'm Stephen Rosen with my wonderful co-host, Colleen Stanley. Welcome, Colleen.
Hey, Stephen, always good to see you. Love our topic today, but I'll let you keep continuing.
The Sales Leadership Awakening podcast is really about helping sales leaders bridge that gap between the knowledge they have and actually doing things and finding ways to do things, which at times is more challenging. Knowledge, as I realize, is easy to gain, but it's the companies that are able to bridge that gap and the leaders that are able to bridge that gap are always the most successful.
Absolutely. So, Stephen, I think the topic, and I'm going to give you credit for bringing this one up. I love how you posed it to me, the accountability dilemma. So let's talk about that a little bit today and have at least 10,000 hours of coaching under your belt. So what are some of the common obstacles you've seen in sales leaders holding their team accountable? Because we all know we're supposed to do it. You can write 5,000 books on it, and yet it is an area that still falls short. So what's your philosophy there and why that's still happening?
Well, that's a great question. As you were asking it, it was funny. I was thinking of parents because some parents are really good at holding it. Some parents are really good at keeping their kids accountable, and some aren't. And you asked me, what is the main obstacle? To me, the main obstacle is fear, a fear of damaging the relationship. Sales leaders worry that if they hold their reps accountable, it might create tension, it might create resentment, it may impact team morale. Another obstacle, as we talked about in a previous podcast, is having clear expectations. If you want to hold people accountable, you really need to be clear on what they're expected to do. So when I coach sales managers, accountability is a big component in my coaching models. It's what I call closing the accountability loop. And what it really means is if someone's committed to doing something, my whole approach is empowering sales reps to make their own plans as opposed to the manager telling them what to do. If you want to create a culture of accountability, it's about open communication and trust. So being clear on what the goals are, making them measurable is a first step in terms of what we train and teach on. So everyone knows what's expected. And then really the key is you don't want to be a micromanager, but you want to have periodic opportunities, regular check-ins where you hold people accountable and they provide feedback on how they're doing. And part of the thing is sometimes we see accountability as being punitive. I used to have a coach that I paid lots of money for. And every time before I had a conversation with them, I would check what I committed to doing. So I would have an answer why maybe I didn't do it or an excuse ready to go, but at least I knew what I was accountable to do. But if you don't have a good coach, then they don't hold you accountable. So you talk about things. So what does anything mean if there's no accountability to following through? By framing accountability as a path to really becoming better, I'm just keeping you on track. I'm here to help you. I think we're going to embrace people to open up and really get rid of some of that fear of worried about damaging the relationship, but having it as this is how we do business here.
It's interesting when you brought up the parent thing. You took me back to many, many years because I grew up in a large family. There were 8 kids. So you literally, as a parent, you could not get all the work done. So every kid, based on their age, had a set of chores. And I think when you got to be the age 7, I think that's the age I was in charge of vacuuming 3 sets of stairs. And I remember thinking, I'm going to break my mom. And I would take that vacuum sweeper and I'd bang it on every step. And I'm telling you, she never flinched. She never talked about it. And guess what? Pretty soon I learned I was accountable for vacuuming 3 sets of stairs every night when I came home from school. So I learned it at an early age.
In my opinion, you had really good parents because it's really a good thing to teach. A lot of times when I've talked to salespeople and someone will say, well, there's no accountability in this organization. And they feel that they're delivering, but others aren't. So if you're not holding people accountable, it actually is a downward spiral of people feeling that, well, I guess whatever they tell me is not important because they're not going to follow up.
It's lowering the bar to excellent and gets a nice little park bench called mediocrity, and everybody pulls it up, starts eating popcorn, feeding the squirrels,
putting their feet up, watching sports, drinking beer in the afternoon, whatever the case may be. But to me, it's so essential as a coach, as a leader, that you're holding your people accountable. And I think that the biggest thing that I try to teach people is it's not punitive. Accountability is not beating someone on the head. It's like, how's it going with this? How is this proceeding? What have you learned? There's some very simple ways to ask the questions that just hold people accountable to do what they said they're going to do.
And when you've got an organization, maybe a sales leader or a salesperson that views as punitive, this is where it's up to the sales leader to reframe that conversation. In reframing, if you almost think of like a PowerPoint deck, you're looking at this particular screen and you need to change the picture on it. So one of the things I always encourage managers to do is to put their teacher hat on. You are not only a coach, but there are times you literally have to teach. And one of the concepts to teach, I think it's David Osberger, he coined the term carefrontation. And the meaning behind that is I care enough about you to confront some blind spots, some areas of improvement. And you literally need to teach that concept to your team, that caring is sharing. Because I know in my own life that when I care about an individual, I'll do the pre-call planning, the prep, but I only share because I care. So if your team has that reframe in their head and you remind them of it when you're sitting down, maybe to have that more difficult coaching conversation, they'll receive the course correction much better. And the other thing is, everybody worries about micromanagement. But as you said, if you set up expectations, accountability, metrics, what have you, the teaching moment is also this: what gets measured improves. Again, not a new statement. But why is everybody walking around with watches that record their heartbeat and number of steps they walk? Because they know I got to get 10,000 steps in today. So we're all doing it. So don't get so wigged out when your manager is measuring metrics and following up on metrics. What gets measured improves. I have yet to see, I've got a friend that does the Ironman and he's done 4 of them. He's 67. And guess what? He's measuring things, how many miles he bikes, swims, and runs. So common sense is if you want to improve, you measure.
So basically, what you're doing is you're reframing to make what people may perceive as negative. See how many people want to work for a micromanager.
Here's my point with that, Stephen. They confuse following up with agreed upon expectations for metrics as micromanagement. That's not micromanagement. So that's where you've got to do the teaching. Hey, listen, folks, we're going to revisit the metrics. I'm not micromanaging, but just like that little watch that you bought, you look at that watch and check, did you get the 10,000 steps in? So we're going to be like the watch around here. So I think reps have to be aware, no, this isn't micromanagement. This is measuring, and what gets measured improves. That's the teaching moment.
And for me, it's setting those periodic opportunities where someone knows you're going to come back and review. We're not trying to catch people. We're trying to make sure they're progressing.
Yes, exactly. So I'm curious, Stephen, if you can think of a time where this isn't to throw anybody in particular under the bus, but I'm guessing you've got maybe a case study where a sales leader was reluctant to hold people accountable. What was the short-term impact, the long-term impact? What happened due to that lack of accountability?
Well, I was brought on to work with the manager of a small to medium-sized company. And as we know, they don't always have all the systems in place that they need. But one of the areas that the manager wanted to focus was holding his team accountable. And we worked on setting up a very simple system. It's stuff we've talked about before. One, setting clear expectations. Two, providing feedback on a more consistent basis, or what I talk about is monthly accountability meetings. Because if you're not doing that, the impact to the organization, if you're not holding people accountable, is your high performers feel frustrated because their efforts aren't going recognized. Sometimes review is you're catching people doing good things. And while the underperformers continue to go ahead without any consequences. And what happened in that situation, team morale was declining, a couple top performers left, and basically this manager was struggling. So we put some simple systems in place to improve accountability. We developed KPIs, or he developed KPIs, established monthly meetings, or what I call monthly accountability meetings, and really focused on just having regular feedback sessions on what the goals are, what the KPIs are, and what their plan is for the next month, because it's always about focusing forward, because we can change what happened in the past. The principles are not difficult, but sometimes you have to help people understand that if you set up systems in place, if you're clear on expectations, then accountability is really key to success within sales. There are so many things going on that we need to make sure that people are doing what they're committed to doing. So can you share some practical steps in terms of top strategies or tools that you recommend sales leaders use to maintain a culture of accountability? And maybe talk about how these strategies change depending on the size and structure of the sales team.
So I would go back to where we started and I would make sure that I'm hiring people that have come from a background of accountability. Now, you don't need to ask if did you have to vacuum the steps when you came home from school? But you do want to have interview questions to vet people. Have they ever been held accountable to any standards, metrics, achievement of goals? Because we all know if you want to make your life easier as a sales leader, hire for the competencies that are going to make your life easier. So it's going to be very hard to have somebody that's never been accountable. They push back on accountability, confusing it for micromanagement. So look at your hiring process, number one. The second, I would go back to become that teacher. Stories are a great way to impart knowledge on accountability. So one of the stories I like to share with clients is that of the Blue Angels. They are a set of pilots here in the United States from the Marines and the Navy. They put on shows all over the country and they are precise, they are professional. But what I love about the Blue Angels, besides the fact that they're the personification of delayed gratification, right, is that after they've done all of their stunts in the air, they come back and they debrief the practice. Now, here's what's interesting. Rank and file is left at the door. And within that room, everyone knows that they're going to speak up freely and say, you missed this, you were 2 seconds late here, you were an eighth of a second late here. But what really impressed me is in reading more about them is that even if somebody didn't spot a mistake, they raise their hand and say, well, actually, I also missed this. Now, there is a culture there of accountability. And if you start sharing stories, we're going to be the Blue Angels here. Don't wait for me to uncover a problem or a challenge or a mistake or whatever needs to be improved. Raise your hand because, you know, what I have found in life, accountable people are also people that have good self-regard. They have the confidence to admit their strengths and weaknesses. So accountable organizations move really fast because you're not sitting there playing the whack-a-mole game like, okay, where'd the mistake happen? Who created the problem? Where to start? You got accountability to go, I own this. Here's how it happened. I don't know how to fix it. Looking for help on how to fix it, but at least you own it. So storytelling can be a great way to build an accountable culture.
That's a fantastic story. I also think when you do that and you take accountability, it eliminates the finger pointing.
It starts at the top because a leader, if they're not being accountable to saying, you know what, I screwed up here. And let's say they blew their cool in a meeting, they need to own up to that right away. Or they proposed a strategy that did not work. Own it. So if you're not modeling it, well, how in the world can you expect your team to be accountable? Because I know Julie, that's worked with me for 10 years now. I'm telling you, here I am, Steve, and I teach emotional intelligence. I was so short-tempered with her. I think it was a couple years ago, and it was not fair. Now, I can tell you why and all the excuses, but I will tell you within 4 hours, I picked up that phone and apologized. And I didn't offer excuses, but I needed to model. I was a jerk this morning. No ifs, ands, or buts, jerk, and I will do better.
So back to our audience who is thinking there's very few cultures that stand up to that standard, that can hit that standard where people hold themselves accountable. But think of the beauty of a culture like that, where I always talk about creating self-managers, self-coaches, people who are self-accountable, right? Oh, I missed this deadline. I won't miss it again, or this is what I'm going to do differently. Because at the end of the day, we're very lucky because we deal with sales leaders, we deal with salespeople who are all high paid professionals. Yet, sometimes they don't always behave as high paid professionals. I always tease sales managers because when I hear excuses, I ask them a very simple question. Are your salespeople high paid professionals? I'm not taking anything away from burger flippers, but I used to be a burger flipper, and always the answer I get is they're high paid professionals. So expect a high level of professionalism. Expect them to have answers to issues. Expect them to follow and let you know if they've missed on something. You don't have to dig to find out that, oh, Steven's missed his sales numbers. Stephen's come to you and said, hey, I've missed my sales numbers, but guess what I'm doing about it? So for all of you out there, it doesn't have to be punitive, as we said. My approach is asking people questions to see where they're at. Colleen, you have some really good approaches to helping people become more accountable. And I think that's something that's really essential within organizations.
It is. Again, if you've got to sit there and play the whack-a-mole game on who done it, we're done. You waste so much time and energy. But here's a note I would also say is when you are establishing a culture of accountability. So with anyone that's worked with me, I have let them know I will be patient on mistakes. I have no patience for excuses and blame. It's a black and white for me. But here's what I had to learn is as people were learning to own up to it, I could not emotionally react. If they owned up to the mistake, then I would generally come back and say, what part of the system do we need to fix? Because what happens is sometimes people still take things personally. And if you start digging around, there's some type of system issue. And I don't care if it's a sales process issue, it's a follow-up issue, but taking the word system took the personal out of it. But I need to train myself as a leader. Oh, wait a minute. You're asking for ownership, raising the hand. Well, guess what? You better not emotionally react. Say, thank you. What part of the system do we need to work on? And then that's where we take it to a system fix.
That's fantastic because I'm working with someone who the biggest issue within the organization, this person's a lower level leader, but their boss has tons of process issues that have been identified. Now, the boss doesn't know how to fix them, but some of the folks who are in the trenches have great ideas. So what my coaching is, do you really want to be a star here? Well, then help your leader fix the issues because you know what they are. And part of being a bold leader is challenging the status quo because maybe that's the way you've done things for years.
Or getting out of it's not my job. Well, guess what? If you want the system fixed, make it your job.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to be a star, it's the people who take the initiative, fix things. And I never thought of accountability as system issues, but I think that's a great analogy to talk about. It's not personal. Sometimes things get missed because you rely on other people. There's a process, and the process is not working at high speed, yet we accept that this is the process. And I talk very much about that as a bold leader, that we need to challenge those things and find better ways. It's nice to challenge, but also the person who comes up with a possible solution or a number of solutions is the one who's going to aspire to greater heights in the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really a key, especially if you're with a fast growth company, because I started in business with a startup. I'm going to tell you, you had to put a lot of systems and processes in place. And if you didn't have people that were owning that, even though it wasn't part of their job description, et cetera, well, the growth would have been inhibited. Now, fortunately, I also had leaders that allowed you to do that. So they weren't double checking if I was putting a system in place, like, is that the right thing to do? So I give credit to both parties. The leaders allowed it, but I'd also say they hired a lot of people that were accountable and responsible and just wanted to get the job done.
I want to add to that because I thought that's a great point. This leader I'm working with, he's a manager. He reports into a director, and the director who got flagged on a number of process issues went to the CEO to talk about what was going on. And the CEO's advice was, you need to empower your people to solve the issues, which is what you just described. I have people who live the issue who can do a far better job than me. So empower your people, make them accountable, but empower them to be successful.
Absolutely. All right. Well, Stephen, always love our chats here. And I know this is one of your passions when you're working with sales leaders. So thanks everyone for joining us today for another Sales Leadership Awakening podcast, where Stephen and I do our very best to help you bridge the knowing and doing gap in sales leadership. Thanks for joining us today.
Great. Thank you, Colleen.